I was on my way to deliver an order from the sandwich shop I worked for. It was a quiet night, around 11 or so. I had my music playing in my car, and I was just running through the motions of the delivery. On my way to their neighborhood, I pulled up to a red light. There was nobody else at the intersection, but for some reason, the light stayed red for what felt like an abnormal amount of time. As I sat there and stared at the light, waiting for it to change, a car pulled up beside me. I only glanced over for a second, not wanting to make that awkward eye contact, but their windows were heavily tinted, like definitely more than what was legal, as I couldn't see a single thing through them. The car itself was black as well, maybe an old Toyota or something. I can't really pinpoint what it was, but I got a really uneasy feeling about them. It could have just been that we were the only two on the road. I'm really not sure. Eventually the light turned green and I started going. I didn't get very far though before noticing they hadn't moved. They were still parked at the intersection. Once I got further down the road, I shrugged it off and just thought it was weird and nothing else. A couple minutes later, I pulled off into the section of housing that the delivery was in. I'd say neighborhood, but it wasn't really a neighborhood. It was just a line of 10 or so houses leading to a dead end. Something about it seemed really off-putting. Of all the houses on the street, not a single one had a light on. I 100% would have thought these places were abandoned, if not for the fact that the houses themselves looked really nice. They looked like ordinary neighborhood homes, with not a single sign of anything wrong with them. I figured it had to just be a coincidence that every resident down the street had their lights off. Anyway, the address I had was for the second to last house. I pulled up and parked on the curb, getting out with the order and walking up to the door. I was hoping I'd at least see some sort of light coming through the windows of this house because it was the one I was delivering to, but standing on the porch, I didn't see any light. Reluctantly, I knocked on the door. When I did, the door swung a bit from its hinges, like it wasn't properly shut or locked. Now this was even more odd. "Sandwich delivery. Anyone home?" It was completely silent. No response, and not even the slightest sound from inside the house. I was gonna leave, but just to be sure I didn't miss anything, I cracked the door open a little further. I could see a hallway and a room. Both were empty of any furniture or decorations, not even a single picture on the wall. It only took a few seconds before dust started coming through the doorway too. I shut it and backed up from the porch. I was very confused and slightly worried. As I walked back down to my car though, I noticed something down the road. A few houses back, there was a small black car that wasn't there when I pulled in. Its headlights were off and it was parked. Once I saw the tinted windows, I immediately recognized it. I felt my face go white, knowing this could not possibly be a coincidence at this point. I started to hurry to my car, but as I got just a few feet away from the road, I saw something move in the reflection of one of the windows. I wasn't sure what it was that I saw, but I stopped in place. I was standing near the passenger door, and through the window, my eyes fell on the back seat. It was dark, but there was something blocking the back window. It only took me about a second for me to realize what I saw. I turned and bolted back to the house. As I did, the back door to my car swung open, and a man in a black hoodie and black pants came running out. He didn't chase me though. He ran straight down to the road and into his car. I stayed on the porch, and with my heart pounding, I dialed 911. I probably could have gotten in my car and left at that point, but I was too scared to really think straight. Police arrived and immediately told me that this whole street was unoccupied, as the homes were new builds. Guess that explains why I thought they looked so nice and not abandoned. What I definitely didn't expect was to hear them say that they've had multiple reports this past week, very similar to mine. The guy would order something for delivery with a fake name and address, then follow the driver. What happened to me was the closest call of any of them, though. The guy had snuck inside my car and was waiting for me to get in and maybe even drive away. Who knows what he was trying to do? Unfortunately, there haven't been any updates on finding him. I was 20 and worked with my parents at a really small takeout restaurant. We specialized in to-go orders. I was in college at the time and was on a very hectic schedule, but my parents were kind enough to offer me a laid-back position just as a general worker, usually just working the to-go table or cleaning up the place after closing hours. This was during early December, and with finals coming up, I didn't have much time to work during the day, so I was taking up mostly late night shifts where I'd just clean for a few hours, then head home. One of the nights I was working, I noticed around an hour into my shift that a car was parked in the parking lot. The way our restaurant was laid out, it was a standalone shop with a tiny parking lot in front of it, so there was no crossover between other stores or businesses. I thought whoever parked there probably just didn't think anyone would care, and they were right, because I really didn't care. 20 or so minutes later, they left. However, the next night, around the same time, the car pulled into the parking lot again. The first time it was fine because I thought it was just a one-time thing, but coming back again was strange. I walked up to the front of the building and looked out. It was an older gray sedan with dark windows. They didn't seem to be trying to hide or anything because they were facing right at the building and they kept their headlights on. I double-checked that the doors were locked before getting back to cleaning. It was hard not to feel like they were watching me through the giant glass front windows, but just like last time, they left not too long after. I finished up my work and clocked out an hour later. Walking to my car in the parking lot, I felt really uneasy. I knew they had left, but it was just concerning that the same car came by 2 nights in a row for seemingly no reason. I drove home and got some rest. Having a lot of schoolwork to do, I decided to take off the next night, so I didn't return to work until the following night. The whole time I was inside cleaning, I had this anxious feeling that made me constantly look out the windows, expecting that car to come back at any point, but I never saw them pull in. I was inside for nearly 3 hours and finished everything I had to do, and not having seen the car come by this night, I felt like maybe it really was all nothing. I packed my stuff up and headed out, locking the door behind me. As I walked through the parking lot, that anxious and uneasy feeling rushed back to me. It felt like I suddenly got a burst of adrenaline, making me sweat and look in all directions. Then, as I was halfway across and standing out in the open, my eyes spotted a car sitting in the far back of the parking lot, away from all the street lamps that lit up the area. Within seconds, it started moving, quickly driving toward me. I sprinted to my car, but I could hear their tires skidding on the pavement as they sped up right beside me and slammed on the brakes. I stumbled forward, thinking they were about to hit me. I was only a few feet away from my car at this point, and suddenly the doors of their car swung open. I didn't even turn my head to look, having my focus completely on getting into my car. Footsteps rushed behind me just as I opened my car and got in. Through the windows, I saw 3 men wearing masks and hoodies sprinting up to me. My hands were shaking as I tried to get my car to turn on. The men started banging on the windows and trying to get the doors open, but I barely got it in drive and drove past them. I got out of the parking lot and onto the road, and from there I was safe. I called 911 and pulled into a well-lit gas station nearby to wait for them. Unfortunately, the outside of our shop didn't have any cameras, so the information the police had to go off of was minimal. I couldn't even see any of the men's faces. After that night, it's no surprise that I never saw the car or the men again. This was last year toward the beginning of December. One of my good friends was going on a trip with his family and would be gone for a whole week. He asked if I wanted to house sit his place while they were gone. We were really good family friends, so this wasn't all that unusual. I actually did the same thing for them last year as well. They had a couple fish tanks and a lot of houseplants that they needed me to take care of while they were away, and in return I'd get to stay at their house for a week. I lived in a really small apartment, so I was always glad to take them up on the offer and help out. I headed over a couple hours before they left, just to hang out and get a refresher on everything that I needed to do. Once they left, I unpacked some things and got settled in, and around 6, I went out to pick up some dinner. I brought it back to the house and ate in the living room while watching TV. Only a half hour later, there was a knock at the door. I paused the show and got up, looking to see who it was. It was a man in his 30s. He wasn't wearing a delivery uniform or anything. He just looked like a regular dude. I cracked the door open and asked what he needed. He looked startled to see me, but quickly recovered and asked if my friend was home right now. He called him by his name, so I thought he might have been a friend or something, but I told him he'd have to come back some other time. He didn't ask anything else and just walked away. I probably should have asked what he needed, but I felt like he should have told me to begin with. I was sure it was nothing, but I texted my friend just to let him know who came by. He called me soon after and asked who he was, and after a brief conversation, he said he had no idea who that guy could have been. I kept an eye out for the rest of the day, but still felt like it was probably nothing serious. I watched TV for a while, then went around the house watering the plants and feeding the fish. Around 9, I started getting the couch set up for bed. I tossed a few blankets down and made a little sleeping area. As I did, there was another knock at the door. I walked over, more confused than anything, but was immediately unnerved to see the same guy outside the door. This time, I didn't open it. "Hey, what do you need? Can you come back a different day?" I yelled through the door. I watched as the man listened and stared at the door like he was thinking, but instead of responding, he just walked away again. I made sure the door was locked before going back to the couch. It was then that I definitely should have called the police, but for some reason I really didn't want to. Especially being at someone else's house, I was worried that this was all just a misunderstanding. Not to mention, the guy hadn't actually done anything yet. I would just have to explain that he came by twice and stood at the door. It kind of sounds silly, honestly. It definitely woke me up though, and I didn't feel comfortable going to bed right away. I stayed up on my phone and had the window curtains open so I could see if he walked up again. I probably waited for a good 2 hours before my eyes started getting heavy. I did one last check out the windows before closing the curtains and getting ready for bed. I brushed my teeth, then hopped in the shower to quickly rinse off. By the time I got out, dried off, and went back downstairs, it had been less than 10 minutes. I went around and turned off all the lights, and before getting in bed, I figured I'd do one last check out the windows, just to help me sleep easy. I looked out, seeing nothing but trees swaying in the wind and the empty road in front of the house. I stepped back, and as I went back over to the couch, my eyes drifted toward the front door, catching something off. The lock was sideways. I walked over, thinking I was seeing things wrong, but no, it was unlocked. I was completely certain I'd locked it, Not even a doubt in my mind. I froze up for a second before I felt adrenaline surge through me. I turned around and crept over to the couch to grab my phone that I left on the end table, but it wasn't there. Someone had already taken it. I didn't stay a second longer, grabbing my keys and running out the front door. I used the emergency button in my car to call 911 as I pulled out of the driveway and parked further down the road to wait. When police pulled up and searched the home, they found the man, same one that came by twice, sitting in one of the spare bedrooms. When they arrested him, he didn't say a word, like he was completely mute. They found a forged key in his pocket that matched the front door, and nobody knows how he got it. My friend told me again that he had no clue who the man was or why he'd break into his home, but it honestly felt like there was something he wasn't telling me. Suspiciously, we haven't talked much after that either. I don't know what was going to happen that night. If I didn't notice the door was unlocked and went to bed, I really don't think I would have woken up. It was a normal night after work, getting home at 10. I was exhausted, but ready to stay up late and game. All my buddies worked early tomorrow, so I was just playing solo and relaxing. A few hours into the night, I heard what sounded like a knock. I took my headphones off and listened for it again, but it was quiet now. I thought surely it had to be a knock at the front door, as it was pretty loud and I didn't know what else it could be. I went over to check it out, but nobody was on the porch. The more I thought about it, a single knock would have been odd if there were someone at the door. I still didn't know what it was that I heard, but I went back to gaming. It must have only been a half hour later that I heard another sound. It was a sort of click, like something closing. I immediately took my headset off and looked behind me. Again, the house was quiet now. I got up and did a walkthrough of the house. I didn't thoroughly check every inch of the place. I was just trying to spot any obvious signs of what I'd been hearing. The house was fairly old, so usually I chalk these things up to being the aging wood. After checking around and not seeing anything, that's exactly what I did, and I went back to my desk. I was still a little hesitant to put my headset back on, but eventually I did anyway. Only a couple minutes later though, a reflection suddenly moved across my computer screen. Maybe it was a shadow, I don't know, but I jumped up and spun around. This time, it was almost like I knew, without a doubt, that someone was inside my home and had just walked somewhere behind me. My desk was in the living room, so there was a long hallway behind it with 3 separate rooms, and at the end was the front door. I took a few seconds to recollect myself and think about which way the reflection moved across my screen, and realized it had moved from the left side of the hallway to the right side. There was only one door on the right, which was to my bedroom. It felt like in that moment, the silence of the whole house was deafening, making each second pass feel more and more terrifying, knowing almost for sure that someone else was in that room. I decided my best bet was to just run for the front door and hope whoever was in the room didn't jump out at me. After a few seconds, I forced myself to move, running down the hall and through the front door. I heard nothing as I fled the house. I called the cops and waited outside for several long minutes. They went in, and I still couldn't believe it when they pulled a man out the front door. I knew someone had broken in, but actually seeing it was really unsettling. He looked around 55, but was very large. His face was uncanny, with wide, bloodshot eyes and a disheveled beard. Even worse, they found 2 knives on him. It seemed he had no particular reason for choosing me as a victim of whatever he was trying to do, which I guess was supposed to make me feel better, But honestly, it didn't. It just means he was completely insane and would have done anything without hesitation had he had the chance to. I think I just got really lucky that night to even be standing here today. I used to work for a small startup company. I'm not even really sure what they did because I was just a security person, but I always thought it was a little strange that they even felt they needed a security guard. The office was really small and looked somewhat unimportant, like any other office. It made my job easy though, because I didn't have to parade around multiple floors all night. I got in at 9 and turned on the security alarm systems, then headed to the little security room that had all the camera screens set up. The place only had outdoor cameras, which were really low quality. The first couple hours went by slowly, with the usual nothing going on. Sometime around 1 a.m. though, I heard what sounded like a latch clicking shut. I sat there confused for a moment, then stood up and opened the door to the hallway. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it. There were only 3 doors down the hallway, and each one was closed. I walked over to each door, opening them and briefly looking around. The rooms were layered with a bunch of office desks, but from what I could see, it was all normal. By now, it had been long enough for me to start wondering if the sound I heard was actually what I thought it was. Maybe I just didn't hear it right. After all, the security systems should have triggered an alarm if someone had opened one of the main doors to get inside. So I went back to the room, this time leaving the door open to the hallway, so if I heard it again, it'd be more clear. Then I sat back and continued monitoring the cameras. I checked the footage from the previous few minutes just to see if I missed anything, but I didn't see anything at all. No movement outside the building. Another 20 minutes passed. I think by then, I'd pretty much came to terms that whatever I heard was nothing, as I was back to not paying as much attention. Then, a sound echoed down the hallway. It was faint. A door opening slowly. I jumped up from my chair and walked into the hallway, not believing what I heard. I immediately saw one of the doors was cracked open. Knowing that none of the alarms went off and nothing had showed up on the cameras, I was extremely confused. I was sure that nobody could be in here. I crept over and opened the door a little further, revealing the dark office room. I took a few steps inside, but didn't hear or see anything, so I started to walk further in, going past each office desk. Then, as I got to the back of the room, I saw the slightest movement on one of the walls, like a shadow or something, before I turned my head and instantly locked eyes with a person crouched underneath one of the desks, hair in large dark circles under his eyes. He had a look of both fear and anger, like he was both mad and worried that I'd found him. The instant we saw each other though, he started getting up. I had no idea if he had any kind of weapons on him, so I took no chances and started running for my life. I went into the hallway and out the front doors, which triggered the security alarms and automatically notified the police. I went a safe distance away, then tried to watch the front doors as I waited for the officers to show up. It only took about 30 seconds before the door swung open and the man came running out. He ran around to the other side of the building, and from there I lost sight of him. When officers got there, we downloaded the footage from the whole night, but nowhere in it did we see the man enter the building, so we don't know when or even how they got in. Obviously, the other question is why they broke in. After discussing it with the company, they said they knew nothing about it and didn't find anything missing. I have a hunch that they might have known more than they let on though. Hiring security for their tiny office isn't normal unless you have a reason to. I think it might have actually been an old employee that they knew was a little unhinged. Anyway, I stayed there for another few months, then called it quits for a better job. I never found out anything else about what happened that night. I was pretty young when this happened. I think 16 or 17. It was at my first job, which was just some trashy pizza place. They paid slightly more than other places, and I made extra from tips when I did deliveries, so I stayed there for a while. I don't remember too much about the beginning of my shift this night. I probably started at my regular time, around 6, and was scheduled until 12, but the whole first half of my shift went by like any other day. It was sometime around 10 that we got an order for delivery, so I packed it up and left to drop it off. The place was 15 minutes away, in a small neighborhood. It took me a minute to find the house though, because all the trees were blocking the address numbers, and a lot of the homes had long driveways leading far from the road. Eventually I did find it, after circling back a few times. I drove down the driveway and parked closer to the home. It was one of those large houses that looked like it was built forever ago. I got the food and walked up to the front porch. It was hard not to notice how quiet it was in this neighborhood. It felt like I was so far away from everything, especially with the trees everywhere. When I got up to the porch though, the front door was wide open. I'd seen a lot of people leave their doors cracked open before, but the way this one was fully open was a little bit excessive. Anyway, I walked over and knelt down to set the food inside the house, when a voice called out, "Hey, would you mind bringing the pizza in here? I'm just setting up the table." It was a man's voice, but they sounded friendly. I knew it was frowned on to enter someone's home while delivering, but honestly, it was a fairly normal request and usually didn't take more than a few extra seconds and typically secured a good tip. I stepped inside and walked down the hallway into the kitchen. I set the box on the table, but nobody else was in there. I'd just heard his voice only moments ago, and I never heard him walk anywhere else. I also noticed the house was extremely quiet, like no other sounds at all. I felt a shiver run through me, and as I decided to leave, his voice called out again. "Can you bring it in here, please?" His voice came from the other hallway connecting to the kitchen. There was a single door that was open, but whatever room was behind it was dark. There was no light on. It also sounded like his voice came from right behind the doorway, like he was standing just out of sight. After a few seconds, I turned around and fast walked back out the front door. I got in my car and drove back to work, and I never said a word about it. I thought I'd either get made fun of for being scared or for being stupid, so I just kept it to myself. Thinking back on it now though, there was definitely something up with that guy. Nothing about that encounter was normal. I'm just glad that at least I was smart enough to leave when I did, because there's really no saying what would have happened if I went into that room with him. This was 3 years ago, just at the beginning of December. Where I live, it doesn't get too cold until late December, and we usually don't get any snow until early January. I go camping pretty often, and typically try to take as many trips as I could before winter comes in, and then I wouldn't be able to go out for several months. I scheduled some time off work for the first weekend of December so I could do one last camping trip. I chose a place an hour north from me. I knew it was a little colder up north, but I didn't think it would be enough difference to matter too much. Besides, I was prepared with camping gear that was also rated for cold temperatures. I headed down there in the morning, arriving at the trailhead just a couple hours past sunrise. There were 2 other cars at the trailhead, one regular-looking minivan and one truck that looked like it'd been off-roading, with mud and scratches all over it. I parked and began down the trail. It was definitely chilly out, so I put my jacket and hat on. Not too long into it, I passed an older man with his kid who looked like they'd camped the night before, so that accounted for one of the cars. When I got to the campsite, I figured there would only be one other group or person there, but it was empty. Just a flat grassy spot near a flowing pond. No other tents or people. I sat my tent up on the edge near the trees. For the first little bit, I spent some time writing in my journal, but as the day went on, it got colder and colder. I got up and built a campfire to help keep me warm. It wasn't too long after that, someone else came walking down the trail. It was a man, maybe 40, and he wore a thick coat and a cloth covering his face. He had a small backpack, but when he passed me and went to the other side of the campsite, I noticed his bag was flat, like there was almost nothing in it. He sat down and leaned up against a tree. I thought he probably had a friend further down the trail that was on their way or something, but a while passed. I don't know, probably 45 minutes, and nobody else came. Also, the man didn't move. He was still just sitting against the tree and staring out at the pond. I didn't know whether to feel bad for him, or be creeped out, or what. But then, kind of out of nowhere, he got up and started walking over to me. Once he got to the other side of the campfire, he stopped and sat down, smiling at me over the flame. "Hope you don't mind if I share your campfire. It's much colder than I expected." I said it was okay, trying to be friendly, but also feeling a bit uncomfortable. There was something off about his smile. The rest of his face just didn't match it. His eyes were droopy and tired, which made his smile seem fake. "Did you bring a tent? It's probably gonna get colder tonight." He shook his head no, but didn't seem worried or concerned at all, still having that smile. After that, there was a good 10 minutes where we both just sat there in silence. During that time, I'd already made up my mind that I wanted to leave, but I was nervous about packing my things up right in front of him. But the sun was nearly set, so if I was going to leave, I'd have to soon. I stood up and went toward my tent, getting my sleeping bag from inside and rolling it up. I could feel the man's eyes staring at me the whole time, and when I turned around, he was looking right at me with that same creepy smile. He stood up, holding his gaze on me, then walked back to the tree he was by earlier. However, he didn't stop. He continued walking past it and into the woods, disappearing from my sight not too far in. I stood still for a minute, listening for his footsteps, but the forest was quiet. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I was sure he'd be coming back any minute. I hurried to get the rest of my things packed, and within 2 minutes, I was heading back down the trail. I left the campfire going, so that if he was watching me from a distance, maybe he'd think I hadn't left yet. The next 2 hours were extremely unnerving, walking in the dark and freezing cold, just hoping I wouldn't hear his footsteps rushing behind me. I made it to my car safely though, getting in and driving home. I noticed at the trailhead, the old truck was gone though, so if it wasn't his, I don't know how that man got there. Regardless, if I'd stayed that night, something definitely would have happened. The man was probably going out into the woods to get something, only to come back soon after and do whatever he was there to do. Or he could have been waiting out there, pretending to have left in hopes that I'd feel safe enough to stay the night, just to come back in my sleep. The imminent events of that night will probably haunt my thoughts for the rest of my life. This was in 2016. I used to live in a remote town with a pretty close community. The whole landscape around the area was flat, dense forest, so basically the only thing to do was go for hikes or go camping. Otherwise, you'd have to drive an hour over to the next, slightly larger town. Me and my friend Matt would go camping a lot, and this time he said one of his other friends recommended a place that we could go, so that's where we went. It was only a 15-minute drive from the outskirts of our town. There was no parking though, we just pulled over on the side of the road. The trail was also very faint and thin, and not something that looked used very often. We walked down, and after an hour, we made it to the camp. Supposedly, there was a nice view of a lake, but his friend must have been messing with us, because it definitely was not a lake or a nice view. It was more of a swamp, like a dark green overgrown pond. It looked like it could have been nice a couple years ago, maybe. After laughing it off though, Matt pointed out a tent on the other side of the water. It was way too far to see anything specific, but it was just a lone tent sitting among the trees. Then my eyes drifted along the edge of the water, further down from the tent. There was a person watching us. They were standing along the pond, directly across from where we were. I did a quick friendly wave, trying to not make it awkward. We both assumed they were the ones staying in the tent. Anyway, we pitched our tents on a hill, away from the water, and carried on with our day. We played a couple games and had some long talks. During the whole day, we occasionally looked out at the water, and we both found it a little strange that we never saw the person near their tent. They were either not there at all, or just walking around in the trees further away. As the day slowly turned to night, there were a few hours where we never saw them. We walked around and collected some scraps to make a fire with, then propped up our chairs close to the flame and made dinner. We were just chatting and having some laughs when Matt suddenly jumped up from his chair. His eyes were locked on something right behind me. I stood up and looked. Standing in the dark, there was the outline of someone standing only 20 feet away. They had long and disheveled black hair and were wearing dark clothing. The shadows covered them too much to tell if it was a man or woman, or if they were holding anything. "Hello?" Matt called out. "Are you okay?" I followed up with. They stayed there for a moment, then hurried away. I looked back at Matt, and although both of us were freaked out, we both nervously smiled, like what the hell was that about? Honestly, this was so long ago, I don't even remember what excuse or theory we came up with for why they were there. We assumed it was the person we saw across the water, but that's all I remember. Whatever we came up with though, it was enough for us to continue the night without being too spooked. Somehow we even went to bed, which looking back on it, I have no idea how. We were just young and overconfident, I guess. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to Matt quickly unzipping my tent and shaking me awake. He was breathing heavily and had a look of fear in his eyes. As I got out, he said he woke up hearing someone outside, and when he opened his tent, he saw that same person standing right by my tent. When they saw him, they ran. He was really freaking out, and I felt like I had to keep a level head as best I could. Our only options were to test our luck walking down the narrow path in the dark, or staying at the camp. We decided to rebuild the fire and stay up all night. We had everything packed up though, in case we needed to make a run for it. As soon as the sun came over the horizon, we got out of there. That day, after discussing it, we decided to put in a report with our police office, just to maybe warn others about someone out there that was acting unusual. We were surprised to get a call back later that day to have us come in for questioning about something. Turned out, the tent we saw belonged to a missing person that had been gone for over a month. They searched the area, but found nothing else. They showed us pictures of the missing person, and both Matt and I were sure it wasn't the person we saw, which is extremely disturbing. Likely that person had something to do with the disappearance of the other person, and had Matt not woken up and scared them off, I probably would have been missing too. This was only a month ago. It was late September, and where I'm at, we were having a lot of rain. Pretty much every day, it was pouring down. I work as an outdoor security guard for a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, so rain doesn't exactly make my job any more enjoyable. Luckily, the company I work for lets me stay inside on rainy nights, but it always made the shift go by a lot slower. Instead of getting to roam around outside the building, I just had to stand by the glass entrance doors and watch for anything. Anyway, this night I got in at 9, locking up the place after all the employees left. It was pouring outside, so I stayed in and stood by the door, and honestly just tried to stay awake. There was nothing to see except rain and the occasional thunder and lightning. A few hours went by. During that time, I just leaned against the wall and made a few trips to the bathroom. But then, as I stood by the entrance doors, fighting to stay awake, there was a deep, creaking thud. It echoed through the whole warehouse. It sounded like bending metal, or maybe a heavy metal door scraping open. It was enough to make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I was sure it was nothing, and just a creepy sound because of the circumstances, but it was kind of my job to check on these things, so I walked down the hallway and looked through each of the corridors. I'd never actually explored much of the warehouse, since I was usually outside. All I knew of was the one main hallway that had 5 or 6 corridors branching from it, leading to large open warehouse areas. I looked down each of these, until I got to the last one. At the end, the door was cracked open. I felt a chill run through me, although I still didn't know if it was already opened or not. I walked over and opened it further. The whole room was dark. "Hello?" My voice echoed through the otherwise silent warehouse. After a few seconds, I started to step back and close the door until I heard something in front of me. It was a voice. It sounded like a man, either mumbling or softly laughing somewhere in the darkness near the tall shelving units. "Is someone there? What the hell are you doing here?" I called out. "Come here." He said something softly. "What?" "Come here," he said a little louder. Still, I couldn't see anything at all. After a couple more seconds, I said "F this" and closed the door. I used my radio to contact the police and left the building through the front. 5 minutes later, they showed up and walked through the building. They came out alone. Security tapes were reviewed, showing what looked like a 50-year-old man with a dark jacket slipping in through a gap in one of the back garages. From there, he made his way into the warehouse room, where I heard him in. And disturbingly, on the footage, it looked like he was holding some kind of knife. He made his exit soon after I left. We don't know why he broke in, or what exactly he was trying to do by telling me to come into the warehouse. It might sound weak of me, but I quit after that and took up a day job instead. I was camping out in the woods in the back of my property. I have a decent amount of forested land, so I like to make use of it and go for a casual camping trip every so often. Just a 10 to 15 minute walk out, I cleared a spot for a campsite. There was nothing special, like any views or lakes or anything. It was just a quiet place out in the woods to relax at. This was sometime in the middle of fall, and on this day, around 4 p.m., I headed down there. When I got there, I began putting everything together, and while I did, I happened to see someone walking out in the forest. They were only 100 yards out or something, but considering this was technically my property, it was a little bit strange for them to be out here. My land was bordered by other neighbors' land, too, so the only way to this spot was by trespassing. I wasn't really upset about it. I was just confused why and how they got here. They were walking away from the direction of my house, though, toward my neighbor's land, so I just let it be. Over the next 3 hours, I saw nothing else and mostly just sat back in my lawn chair and relaxed to the sounds of the forest. The sunset fell over the trees and left the woods dark and foggy, so I lit up the fire pit I'd made and stashed it with some logs and sticks. It was just about an hour into the night, and as I was tossing more sticks into the campfire, I suddenly heard footsteps in the distance. I turned around and could hear someone running, like full-on sprinting through the woods, but it was pitch black out there. I just listened and followed the sound with my eyes as they ran past my campsite and deeper into the forest, slowly fading out. It was 100% a person too, from the sound of it, but I'm not sure there's any explanation for what they were doing sprinting through the woods at night. It made me really uneasy. I thought about packing up and going home, but it sounded like they didn't notice me or didn't care to bother me, whoever it was. I figured I was okay, and if anything, at least it was just a quick run back to my house. I kept the fire up and stayed outside for another 2 hours. Aside from the running earlier, it was a very quiet night. Around 10, I let the fire fade out and got in my tent, falling asleep soon after. Of course, I wasn't asleep for long though. I woke up to sudden footsteps sprinting toward my tent. My eyes shot open and I sat up, hearing the footsteps come right up to the outside of the tent, then abruptly stop maybe a foot away. My eyes began adjusting to the dark, and through the thin fabric, I could see the silhouette of someone leaning back and forth, like they were trying to look through it. Then there was the sudden sound of something tearing. My eyes looked a little bit to the left, seeing a knife sliding across the fabric and cutting a slit into the tent. Through it, a pair of eyes pierced through at me. I jumped up and bolted out of the tent, screaming and yelling as I ran into the woods. The adrenaline kept me going all the way back to my house, and I didn't hear their footsteps behind me, so it seemed like they didn't follow. However, when I called the police, I looked out the back window and caught sight of a figure standing in the trees, watching me. When officers came, whoever was out there had left. In the morning, they came back out to investigate the campsite, but days passed with no leads. Not only was it terrifying that they were out in the woods on my property, running around at night with a knife and cutting open my tent, but they also followed me back to my house, so they knew where I lived. I was on edge, barely getting any sleep for the next month. So far, nothing else has happened. If anything does, hopefully I'll still be able to update you on it.
A few years ago, I was driving a few hours away to have Thanksgiving with my parents. The traffic was horrendous for the first half of the trip, but once I got out into the countryside where my parents lived, the roads cleared up. About 30 minutes before I got to their house, I realized I needed to get gas. Just then, I saw a sign telling me about a gas station at the next exit. There was no other sign saying there would be anything else there. That's kind of how it is in the country. When I pulled off the highway, I saw that the place was even more depressingly empty than I expected. Aside from the gas station, which still had old-style pumps, there were a few other buildings that had been abandoned. I pulled up to a pump and saw a sign on it that said, "Cash only, no self-service." So I hopped out and headed into the store, noting that there were 2 cars parked outside. I walked in, figuring I'd see someone at the register and some other person buying stuff, but it was totally empty. The bell above the door echoed through a totally silent, still environment. It smelled dusty and mildewy, with a bit of rusty metal in the air, as well as the wafting odor of someone taking a dump in the bathroom. I waited at the counter for about a minute before I started to get a weird feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I peeked around the aisles and saw nobody. When I called out for someone to help me, I didn't get an answer. Finally, I found the bathroom door, tucked away in the back corner. The light was on too. I walked over to it, intending to knock. But then it suddenly swung open, and a man practically jumped out at me. He said there was a spill in there or something, so the bathroom was closed until he cleaned it up. I laughed and said that was okay since I wasn't far from my destination. I clocked him for having just blown up the toilet, as he was sweating and breathing heavily, and the air coming off him was very foul. After I told him I just needed to pay for some gas, we walked over to the counter together. I couldn't tell if he was new to the job or just embarrassed and flustered, as he seemed to struggle to carry out the transaction. When he finally got through it, he told me to have a good day. I reminded him that there was no self-service, so he had to come and pump my gas for me. He got really confused for a second, then kind of sheepishly asked me if I could try figuring it out on my own. I thought for a second, then shrugged and went along with it. I walked back to my car and tried to use the pump, but the thing was so old and weird that I got confused. I decided to walk back inside and get the attendant to do his job. But when I came through the door again, the man came storming back from the bathroom, screaming at me to get out of the store. He pointed to the door, and that's when I noticed blood on his hands. He realized I saw it too. We stared at each other for a few seconds, both of us unsure what to do. Then suddenly, he ran at me. I shoved him back, then bolted out the door. I ran back to my car as the man chased me, barely getting inside and managing to lock the door before he could get in. I frantically searched for my keys as the man tried to break through the window, frantically starting my truck and speeding out of the station. I tried to get back on the road as quickly as possible, but before I knew it, the man had gotten into his van and was still chasing after me. I floored it to get on the main highway, but he caught up to me on the ramp and rammed into the back of my truck. He was trying to run me off the road. On the highway, he got into the lane next to me and started creeping up on my left side. I knew he was trying to outmaneuver me, so I hit the brakes hard, causing him to soar past me. Nobody was on the road around us, so I made a highly illegal U-turn over the median and started driving the other direction. I didn't want him following me to my parents' house. I didn't know the extent of what this guy was capable of, but he was obviously unhinged and dangerous. Thankfully, the switch-up gave me enough time to get out my phone and call 911. I expected to see the van race up to me again, but by then, he had given up. However, I was so far out in the middle of nowhere that the operator told me it would take a sheriff 20 minutes to get there, which I knew gave that guy plenty of time to get away. I ended up going to my parents' place, but before we sat down for dinner, I got a call back from the cops. They wanted me to come to their station and make a statement. When I got there, one of the first things they told me was that the body of the store owner had been found in the bathroom, his stomach cut open and his bowel pierced, mixing fecal matter into the blood at the crime scene. The sheriff was an older man, probably had 30 years on the job. By the look on his face, I could tell he'd never seen anything like it. I couldn't believe it either. The man I was in the store with wasn't even an employee after all, just a crazed killer. I told them everything I could, even how I realized the odor I smelled wasn't funny at all, as it must have been the victim's internal feces. Unfortunately, they never caught the killer. They never figured out the motive either. The best I can figure is that I interrupted an amateur black market organ harvester. Every Thanksgiving, when people talk about stuffing and carving up turkeys, all I can imagine is that poor guy's mutilated corpse. When I was 17, Halo Reach came out. My twin brother and I had played through all the Halo campaigns together, so of course we had to get the newest one. Unfortunately, our mom wouldn't buy it for us when it came out, so we had to wait for the Black Friday sale at Walmart. We saved up some cash from mowing the next-door neighbor's lawn. A new family had just moved in a few weeks prior, and even though they apparently had a son I had never seen, he wouldn't do it, and the father was too busy at work all the time. On Black Friday, we drove over to Walmart and fought through the ridiculous crowds to get to where they had games. Before we got there, my brother somehow got into a conversation with a girl from our high school. They talked for at least 5 minutes, making me irritated with him for spending so much time and energy trying to get with her. Our stated mission was to get in, buy Halo Reach, then get out and go home to play the whole campaign in one sitting, not bragging about doing yard work and asking for phone numbers. I kept trying to pull my brother away, but we got annoyed with each other. I was getting impatient, but I was also stepping on his game. He eventually handed me his share of the cash and told me to just go get the game myself and meet me back at the same spot. I couldn't stand listening to my brother talk about shared algebra teachers and house parties, so I went my own way. I weaved through the people and took a copy of the Halo Reach case off the shelf, then got in line at the electronics register to pay and actually get the disc. Right after I got in line, I noticed somebody get in line behind me. Soon after, I felt them breathing down my neck, like they were looking over my shoulder. I turned around, about to tell them to get out of my personal space, but I bit my tongue when I saw the guy. He was built like a linebacker, but as if all that extra mass was straight bone. I eventually managed to ask if I could help him, and he took a few seconds to formulate a response. "That's a co-op game," he said. I replied that I knew that, and I was going to play with my brother. Then, the guy shook his head and told me I should play with him instead. He started bragging how he'd beat every Halo game on Legendary, but of course, so had I. His face turned red, and he lied quite obviously about beating them with all the skulls on, which makes the game 10 times harder. I called him out for making things up. Then suddenly, he grabbed my wrist and squeezed me so hard that it cut off the circulation. He pulled me in right up to his face and growled the words, "Play with me." I was about to shout for help, but just then, I heard the voice of the cashier call out to us. He was half yelling to break up the scuffle and half just trying to keep the line moving, but I was fully thankful for him. While we had been talking, all the people ahead of me in line had gone through, so after the brute dropped my hand, I walked up and paid for the game. During the entire transaction, I felt him breathing down my neck again, but this time, he was literally fuming. I was scared he might do something like grab the disc right after I bought it and snap it in half, or worse, snap my neck. After I had the game in the bag, I turned around and looked at the guy before walking away. That's when I noticed there was nothing in his hands. It hit me that he was never waiting in line to buy anything. He was only there to talk to me the entire time. I took a step back and he took a step forward. I started to turn and walk away, but he was already following me. I panicked and burst out into a full sprint. I bumped into several people and got sworn at for yelling a bunch, but I managed to get away around a few corners. Then I found my brother. He was still talking to the girl, but when he saw my face, his mood changed. I told him we needed to go, and thankfully, he had finally gotten her number, so I was able to get him away from her. In the car, I told him about what happened, but he didn't quite get the extent of it. He didn't give me a hard time, though. I guess he was on cloud 9 from the combo of getting a girl's number and being minutes away from playing a new Halo game. As soon as we got home, we booted it up and started making our way through the campaign. Night fell about halfway through, so I got up in between missions to close the blinds so nobody could see in. I looked across the gap to the new next-door neighbor's house, seeing that there was a light on in a window. And under that light was that same brutish creep that grabbed me at Walmart. My heart sank. That was the neighbor's kid? The whole time I thought he was an adult. Even through the window, I could see the rage in his face watching my brother and I play together. I snapped the blinds closed and went back to the game, trying to forget about him. Unfortunately, for the next year and a half, I was tormented by that freak. He never did anything, but he watched me from his house like a hawk, day and night. I asked my mom about him, and she said after talking with the mother, she learned her son had been banned from his previous school district for severe anger management problems, forcing them to move to a different county and enroll him in a specialized school to help him with it. I guess it was working, because I could see in his eyes the brutal violence he was barely holding back. I went shopping at Target with my friend Stephanie the day before Thanksgiving. The plan wasn't to buy much of anything, but to pick out what we wanted to grab when we came back on Black Friday. That way, we also could see the difference in prices between the 2 days and find out if the Black Friday deals were actually any good. I wanted to go to the electronics department and do some research on a new camera for myself and a new TV for Steph, since she was planning on moving into my spare bedroom and didn't have a TV of her own. I was browsing the cameras, holding one of the display models, when a Target employee walked up to me asking if I needed any help. He was a bit creepy looking, and he was already looking at my boobs a lot. But he was the only employee in the electronics department, and I was getting confused by the different aspects of the cameras, so I let him help. I told him I was looking to get into photography as a hobby, so I didn't want to spend a lot of money. He asked me if I was planning on taking more pictures or videos, and I answered that I would probably do a little of both. That's when a very concerning smile spread across his face, and I immediately got a bad feeling about him. He said I would probably want a nice microphone and a ring light for my filming setup too. I told him I wasn't going to do anything like that, and I wanted a camera strictly for taking photos of things. Then, he pointed to my chest and said, "You mean those things, right?" I told him to shut up and that he should have some basic respect, and that he should be doing his job instead of hitting on me. Instead of apologizing, he said I could make a lot of money on OnlyFans with my body, and that he would be the first subscriber. Better yet, he'd be part of the videos too. I was about to hit this guy when Steph walked up to join me at the worst possible time. He whistled at her and asked if she was my girlfriend. She and I just had to film each other making out and doing other things, obviously. I finally had enough and shoved the display camera in his face. Then I grabbed Steph and we stormed out. I cussed and complained about that creep for a solid 10 minutes, declaring I would never shop at that Target again if that was the sort of person they hired. In fact, while I was still in the parking lot, I called the store and got a manager on the phone just to report him. I told her the name of the person who harassed me, Colt. That was what it said on the name tag anyway. My heart sank when she told me there was nobody on the staff with that name. And of all people, she would know. Steph and I immediately felt a great sense of danger and drove out of the parking lot right then and there. We went home to my apartment, where I told Steph that I wished she was already moved in instead of waiting until December 1st, with sickos like that fake employee at Target in the world. It's really scary to live alone. She offered to start moving things into the room that day if I didn't charge her rent for the last week of November. But I didn't care about screwing my friend out of almost $200, so I jumped on it. I even helped her move. It was about noon when we started, so we were able to make several car trips from her parents' place to mine, getting almost everything she had except the bigger pieces of furniture, which we planned to rent a truck and grab on Saturday. She would have had to sleep on the couch for a night or two, but that was fine with her. Even though it was late November, it was still 80 degrees out where I lived, so we both worked up a sweat and had to change into shorts and tank tops, which were still soaked by the end of the day. That evening, Steph and I felt much better about things. The next day, we invited some friends over for a small Friendsgiving. Everything was going just fine until the morning of Black Friday. Steph and I got ready to go shopping, but when we opened the door, there was a camera sitting on my welcome mat. I knew exactly what camera it was. The display model that I shoved into the face of that Target creep. I almost fainted. Steph didn't recognize it, so she picked it up and started looking through the photos. Her face went white as a sheet. I had to know what was on it. There were nearly 100 pictures and videos, all of which were of me, Steph, and our friends. The first was a video of our butts as we walked away from him after the initial encounter. After that, there were pictures of us in my car as he followed us to my apartment. Then, he photographed us as we carried heavy objects inside, wearing light clothing and sweating profusely. He even peeped through the window at our Friendsgiving. Unfortunately, he got several partially exposed shots of me in the bathroom too. The last picture taken was just a piece of paper with writing on it saying, "I told you so." That led me to assume he downloaded the pictures off the camera and uploaded them to the internet, maybe selling them to some pervert friends of his. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to smash the camera, but Steph took it out of my hands before I could and called the police. We showed them the photos and I gave them a description of Colt, even though that probably isn't his real name. I asked if we could access the security footage at Target, but they made a bunch of excuses basically amounting to it wasn't serious enough. Apparently being stalked by a potentially dangerous predator and voyeur for 2 days doesn't warrant a woman any help from the police. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that. I guess the creep got what he wanted. I've never stopped thinking about it though.
This story takes place in 2016 on a nice warm summer day. I was out for a walk, enjoying my time off from school and work, just getting some fresh air. Any time away from work and school was a good day for me. I didn't like the job I worked at very much, and I was a bit of a loner in school, and I didn't have many friends. I would get bullied quite frequently, so that right there, I suppose, would be more than enough of a good reason for me to hate school. Anyways, I don't want to get off topic here, so back to the story. I was walking through this trail, and I had been walking for just over 5 minutes, I'd say, when all of a sudden, I heard something in the woods. I genuinely didn't think much of it at all, as it most definitely wasn't uncommon to hear a squirrel, or maybe a bird or something every now and then. The sound continued for at least a minute, and the longer time went on, the more muffled the sound would become. Whatever it was clearly moving in the same direction as me, but much faster. I kept walking, still not thinking much of the situation. I was approaching a curve in the trail that took a sharp left turn, and almost as soon as I made it past the curve in the trail, that's when I saw him. There was a guy that was dressed up as a clown. I paused for a second, and I stood there just looking at him. He was standing directly in the middle of the trail. I don't know if you guys know about this or remember, but I'm sure you do. Just in case you don't, I want to briefly go over it. Back in 2016, there was a huge trend going around where people were dressing up as clowns all throughout the world, especially America. Most of them were just harmless teenagers who were being angsty and trying to scare people and get a good laugh or whatever. But there were people out there who had much more devious intentions. I've also heard some pretty horrible things that happened on the news, where clowns had been caught trying to kidnap or even physically harming innocent people. Anyways, I was taken aback by this when I saw the clown face to face, but I didn't want to seem like I was scared. Because if he did have ill intentions, which honestly I highly doubted at the time, I didn't want to give him what he wanted, which was to scare me, obviously. He didn't seem to be armed either, so I was sure I could take him should he try to pull something crazy, like try to hurt me or whatever. We made awkward eye contact for a moment, and neither of us said a word. Not until I worked up the courage to ask him who he was. "Hello, who are you?" That was all that was said. At this point I realized it was probably time to go. The man was staring at me still and hadn't moved a muscle. He then began walking towards me, and I took a few steps back. Remembering that I didn't want to seem scared, I said screw it and began walking towards him as well. As we were getting closer to each other, my heart rate increased more and more. He seemed to stop when we were right next to each other, but I kept walking, all while not looking back, not even once. I then chuckled to myself when I realized I fully made it past him and he was completely out of sight, because I realized I got all worked up for nothing. Anyways, I finished with my walk, and I didn't see the clown again for the rest of my walk. Fast forward to the evening, I was sitting at home making dinner, when all of a sudden, I thought that I heard something come from outside. I opened the sliding glass door that was in my living room and stuck my head out and scanned my backyard with my eyes. Nothing. There was nobody at all in sight. There were many blind spots that someone may have been hiding, mind you, from where I was positioned, but I chalked it up to be just my imagination and that I was overthinking. I shut the door and locked it and continued making dinner. It couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 minutes later that I heard an aggressive, heavy-sounding knock that came from my kitchen window. I quite literally jumped out of fear and I hit my head on the cupboard that was above me. That was when I legit started to have a panic attack. Let me tell you, I didn't know fear until this moment. This was by far the most frightened I had ever felt in my life. I grabbed the knife that was sitting next to me on the counter and I tried to look out the window, but it was too dark for me to see anything at all. I rushed to my back patio light and I turned it on immediately. The second I turned on the light and before I was about to open the sliding glass door, I saw him. It was the same clown from earlier. He was standing right there on my back patio, only a few feet away from me. Looking back, I wish I would have ran out there and stabbed him or something, or at the very least scared him off, but I didn't. It's hard to say what you would do in a certain situation until you're in said situation, trust me. I ran upstairs to my room and I locked myself in the bedroom and proceeded to call the police. The knocking sounds continued and I could hear them all the way from upstairs. I had no idea who it was, or why they were harassing me, or how they even knew where I lived. But something tells me, even still to this day, that it was someone that knows me, which makes it all the more personal and scary if you ask me. I waited for the police to get there, which felt like an hour. They actually arrived fairly quickly though, and made it here in less than 10 minutes, give or take. The knocking continued, and it grew louder and louder as time went on. Then I about shit myself when the clown started laughing, in this very delirious, insane type of laugh. I literally thought I was just waiting to die. I thought that at any second, the man was going to break in and attack me, and that I was going to have to put up a fight. I thought to myself over and over how if he really wanted to, I'm sure he could just break through just about any of my windows in the house and let himself in that way. Finally, I heard police sirens in the distance, and they finally arrived only a handful of seconds after. One of the officers knocked on the door, and I rushed down there immediately to let him in. Of course, looking through the peephole first, to make sure it wasn't the clown. I let him in and I spoke with him, while the other officers searched for the clown. I couldn't believe it, but the clown was gone. Out of sight and out of mind, I guess. That's the way I like to look at it, because I haven't had a single incident ever since with any more clowns. Or anyone at all for that matter. Sometimes, even thinking back about this story, I can't believe that this in fact happened to me. You never think something this horrific will happen to you until it does. Things could have ended way differently hadn't the cops shown up so quick. In this case, these cops legit saved my life. My name is Edgar, and this happened last year. I was walking to a nearby carnival that was going on near my house last summer to meet up with my friends. The city has been doing this carnival for us every year, ever since I can remember. And I like to go at least once or twice a year. I'm one of those kids that likes to stay inside and play video games in my free time, so it's nice to get out and do something that's actually fun for a change. The town I live in has nothing fun to do at all. There is almost nothing to do. And all the other cooler and bigger cities are over an hour away. And I don't have my license yet. Nor do I have a whole lot of friends that would be willing to do this kind of stuff with me. Most of my friends are also introverted themselves, and we would much rather play our video games online, rather than actually go and hang out with each other in person most of the time. As antisocial as I am though, it's in our human nature to socialize. I get quite bored sometimes just sitting at home, so this was supposed to be us friends having a nice evening. When I got there and I found my friends, Nathan and Oscar, we rode some rides, played some of the carnival games, and even got ourselves some snacks. It was quite fun and we were all having a good time. After a little while, we kind of ran out of things to do, so we started pondering the idea of leaving and just going home. Nathan said he wanted to stay a little bit longer before we left, and I was okay with that, along with Oscar as well. So what do you guys want to do? I asked. Well, we could go see what's going on over there in that tent, Nathan said. There was a circus tent that we hadn't explored yet, and that was going to be the last thing we did before we took off, I imagined. So we headed over there, and when we got inside, we saw that there were a group of clowns performing on the stage. They were dancing, juggling, and one of them was riding a unicycle. We decided we wanted to get closer to the stage, so we made our way up to the front. After watching them for a little while, we were getting bored and we were about to leave. But just before we were about to leave, the clown that was riding the unicycle slipped and fell, and his red clown nose fell off and landed right next to me. I hurried to pick it up and I put it in my pocket, not thinking too much about it. I figured he had plenty more of those sponge-like noses, so I didn't think twice about taking it, and I really didn't think that the clown would care. He got back up and continued performing like nothing happened, after he made a quick joke about falling. I didn't think the clown noticed I picked up his nose until he turned his head and made prolonged eye contact with me. I thought that was weird and it kind of made me uncomfortable, but I figured he was just messing around. I told Nathan and Oscar that I was ready to leave and they agreed. Nathan's mom was already waiting for him in the parking lot, and Oscar had to walk a completely different way to get home than I did, so we said our goodbyes and off we went. I took the clown nose out of my pocket and I was playing with it and just looking at it, because I had never seen one in real life before. I thought it was kind of cool that I had it because it was kind of like a souvenir for me to keep. Suddenly, I heard a slight chuckle. I had already been quite a ways from the carnival and all of the people. Or so I thought anyways. It really spooked me and jump scared me at first. It wasn't like a normal laugh, it had more of a sinister tone to it. It was extremely creepy. When I turned around, all I could see was a dark shadowy figure that looked like a person. I shined my flashlight over towards them and almost right away, I noticed that it was one of the clowns from the carnival.
I believe you have something of mine,
the clown said. The way he sounded when he said that was just absolutely petrifying. He barely sounded like a human, almost like an entity or a damn demon of some sort. Now, I'm not saying he was a ghost, all I'm saying was I knew right then and there that something horrible was about to happen. I slowly backed away and told the clown that I didn't have anything of his and to please leave me alone.
Well, if you aren't going to give me my nose back, I'm going to need yours then.
After that, he took out what looked like to be a Phillips screwdriver and pointed it at me. It was at that exact moment that I started running, as fast as I could, and I didn't look back once, literally. I ran through the woods rather than taking the road home because I knew a shortcut through the trails that led into my neighborhood. That might have been a risky move on my part, but I was thinking in the moment, and I made a split-second decision. I'm not even sure how long he chased me for because that's how fast I ran. He was a bigger guy, so I doubt he could have ran as fast as me anyways. I told my mom exactly what happened when I got home, and she told me we should call the police. We called them, and they showed up to our house, and we talked about what happened to me. They said they couldn't do much as they had no idea what the man looked like. That really upset me because I feel like there was something we could have done. That clown most likely worked for some company that we could call and get a hold of, so we could find his real identity. But we were never able to find out who it was. I definitely won't be going back to that carnival ever again. This story also takes place back in 2016 in the clown era. I was sitting at home one night, lying in bed, looking at my phone before bed. It was late, and it was way later than I would usually stay up, but I remember that night I couldn't sleep for whatever reason. But luckily it was the weekend, so I didn't have to be awake at 5:30 in the morning the next day. I was lying there about to drift off to sleep when all of a sudden I got this strange feeling that I felt like I was being watched. Evidently I'm not insane and my intuition was correct, because when I put my phone down and looked around my room, as my eyes glanced over my bedroom window that was right next to my bed, I saw the face of a clown peering at me with his face up against the glass. Now, of course, this scared the living shit out of me and I immediately screamed. I ran out of my room and I went to find my dad. He was actually awake, to my surprise. Probably because he heard me scream from across the other side of the house. I told him how there was a man dressed up as a clown in our backyard, and that was why I screamed. I've always been terrified of clowns, but man, this mask that he was wearing was quite creepy and disturbing. It almost didn't even look like a mask, it was all too realistic. My dad, of course, ran outside looking for the clown, and he looked around outside for over 5 minutes, but there was no one to be found. Not a single clown or person in sight. My dad told me that I was just having a bad dream and to go back to sleep. But I told him I wasn't dreaming and that I was sure that there was really a clown there and that I'm not just losing my mind. There was no way it was a dream because I wasn't even sleeping. Besides, there was literally a whole entire outbreak about these clowns going on, all throughout the country. It kind of angered me that my dad wasn't taking the situation very seriously. I went back to my room and I grabbed a knife along the way, and I kept it beside me while I lied awake in bed once more, trying to get my anxiety straight. I even put a blanket over my window, that way the clown wouldn't be able to see inside, should he have come back. I lied there for just under an hour, I would say, and I started to feel better about the situation. Maybe I was just dreaming, I thought. Even though I could have sworn that I hadn't fallen asleep yet. Sometimes weird things happen in our sleep stages, and I'm aware of that. So I let myself believe that it was nothing, and that I was just letting it get to my head. Then, as I was finally managing to drift off to sleep for once, I heard this very light and faint tapping sound coming from my window. I immediately awoke in fight or flight mode, and I gained the courage to peek outside. I moved the blanket over to the side, and I poked my right eye out of the window, and I saw a man standing there dressed as a clown. I couldn't see exactly what he was doing, but it looked like he was trying to open the window. He was most definitely trying to kidnap me or something, no question about it. At this point, I knew I wasn't dreaming for 100% certainty. I didn't scream this time either, and I wasn't sure if he had saw me or not. I was hoping that he didn't notice that I saw him this time. That way he wouldn't be spooked and run off again. I rushed all the way to my dad as fast as I possibly could. He was sleeping this time, but I awoke him within seconds of arriving in his room. He followed me to my bedroom and looked out the window where the clown was, and there he was. The clown was still there, trying to break in. "Holy hell," my dad said. My dad told me to stay put and to call the police. Then he rushed outside, and when he found the clown, he was no longer by the window. He was standing directly in the middle of our backyard with a bat in his hand. My dad charged at him anyways, and the clown braced himself, ready for my dad's attack. As my dad got close enough, the masked man took a swing right for my dad, and somehow my dad managed to tank the hit to his side and disarm him. My dad started beating the literal hell out of this guy and was half near killing the man by choking him. My dad let the weird guy go, and only a few minutes later the cops arrived. We explained everything we could, the best we could, to the police, and they even went searching for him. But as far as I know, the police never turned up with him. We never had another incident like this ever since. I think that clown got the message from my dad loud and clear. I wish that weirdo would have gotten arrested though. But the most important thing is that nothing happened and that my father was able to protect me. I was only 14 years old when this happened, so that's why I couldn't really stick up for myself so much. My dad really is a true hero.